Shwmai, prynhawn da I chi gyd.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome and thank you for participating in this debate this afternoon, climate change, whose responsibility?
Climate change, whose responsibility? And can I just remind you that translation services are available if you wish. Just click on the world icon, choose English as a language, and you'll be able to follow just fine if you wish to do so. Felly, mwyn I chi gael...
So just to give you some context, I'm Steffan Griffiths. I present the weather on S4C and have been doing so for some 7 years now, having started immediately after graduating in physical geography at Aberystwyth University before taking a master's in glaciology. And following that degree in geography, it means that you get some lovely field trips, and I've been fortunate enough to visit and to work on some of the most beautiful glaciers in the world, in my view, from New Zealand to the European Alps and the Himalayas too. Glaciers and are areas that are on the front line as a result of climate change, and going to these places can be quite sad because you do hear about places suffering in terms of the Arctic, the Antarctic and the cryosphere, those frozen areas across the world. But when you go there and see the impact with your own eyes and see how much these glaciers have receded and melted over the years, then it does bring the thing very much to life. Because these glaciers, as I've mentioned, are shrinking. The waters flowing from these glaciers also have an impact on the patterns of life for the people who are dependent on these waters down the valley. For example, the Khumbu Valley in Nepal at the foot of Everest, the people living in that area are very reliant on the meltwater coming from the different glaciers at different years, different times of the years, in order to irrigate their crops and so on. So once the patterns change, that has an impact on crops, which ultimately has an impact on how they live their lives. So it's the indirect impacts of the glaciers melting, but ultimately these waters do reach the oceans and lead to an increase in sea levels, and that's having an impact on us here in Wales because we are virtually surrounded by these waters, and the latest government statistics suggest that we are expecting an increase of around 20 centimetres in sea levels by the middle of the century, which doesn't sound huge, but when you add factors of extreme weather, strong winds, large waves, there are many people living in these coastal areas, and the social and economic impacts will be huge as a result of the melting glaciers, the increases in sea level too. So from one pole to another and everywhere in the middle, the impact of humans on the world is very clear. So as we're starting a new decade, a decade which may decide the course of human history in years to come, this is the time to make crucial changes. And is COVID-19 perhaps the catalyst that we need to transform into a world which is less polluted? As it happens, I've just finished filming a documentary for S4C on the impact of COVID-19 on the environment, and this will be broadcast in the autumn. And there we have discussions with individuals living in cities across the world who enjoy a less polluted climate thanks to the reduction in work activities and travel from Hanoi, Vietnam, to Hong Kong and to London, where people have changed their working patterns, where they used to work in cities but now are doing the same kinds of work in rural areas but don't have to travel huge distances in order to do those jobs. I'm also looking at the inexhaustible renewable energies available here in Wales and asking the question whether the £3 billion of investment allocated is sufficient for a green future. On an encouraging note, from my personal experience and through speaking to people and in looking at different surveys, the majority do favour green investment for the future, but global warming and climate change is a major issue. So whose responsibility is that? us on the ground, or is it up to politicians to lead the way? Personally, I think both has a responsibility with the correct decisions being taken, but also people on the ground having the right attitudes and being willing to change. For example, it's that change that we've seen in the city centre in Cardiff. This was one of the most polluted streets in Wales, but now the traffic has disappeared from Castle Street and the road is now in the hands of cafes, and it's a different atmosphere in the city without that air pollution, but also without that noise pollution too. I was there about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the change is astonishing. It's like a different city. And although the change has been staggering, and an example that when things have to be done, it can be done, as this pandemic has demonstrated. Now, climate change is a major topic, and there will be a number of impacts as a result of climate change, impacts that we're seeing at the moment, such as extreme weather events, and this has been a perfect example of those extreme weather events. We're expecting to see wildfires, crop failures, and drought, to name a few of the problems here in Wales. We're expecting wetter winters and warmer and hotter summers, drier summers, and an increase in sea levels and more storms. So we will have to safeguard our communities, water resources, land usage, ecosystem protection, and reducing carbon emissions, which are crucially important. They have reduced quite a bit during this year, but the levels are still higher this year than they were last year. So although there's been some slowdown this year, that trend is still there and it's still gradually increasing. It'll be interesting to see beyond this lockdown period over the next few years whether things truly have shifted and changed, or will those levels increase gradually and consistently over ensuing years as we try and restore the economy. These are things that we will know the answers to in a few years. But in the ongoing battle to tackle climate change today, we will focus on rubbish and plastic waste, because I know that you as young people and members of the committee are very passionate about changing the situation in terms of plastic waste. Plastics and microplastics have reached all corners of the world now, even entering the food chain. We have seen the disastrous pictures of wildlife consuming or being caught in plastics, and it seems that there are now 1 million plastic bottles of various drinks sold every minute across the world, which is incredible to me. The environment has devolved here in Wales, and that has led to things like charging for plastic bags and recycling targets, which mean that Wales are topping the leagues in terms of recycling, second in Europe and third on a global level, with the intention of banning many single-use plastics like straws and cotton buds by next year. This debate is very, very topical, more topical than ever perhaps, because this period has led to a plastic pandemic. During lockdown, the demand for plastic and packaging has gone through the roof, with PPE, which of course is so crucial, but also Amazon deliveries up 65% and far more people ordering takeaways than usual. And these trends are likely to continue for the rest of the year, particularly with the outdoor cafes opening now. As part of this afternoon's debate, we will take contributions from members of the Youth Parliament, including Caleb Rees, Youth Parliament member for Ceredigion, Evan Fairclough, Youth Parliament member for Pontypridd, Abby Carter, member for Sir Alwyn, Evan Burgess, member for Aberconwy, and Anwen Rodway, the Learning Disabilities Wales Welsh Youth Parliament members. Now, I've given you some of the background there, so without further ado, we will move immediately into our debate if you're ready. You will have an opportunity to express your views, of course, and you're welcome to ask questions, raise points during this hour. But we will start by asking for some opening remarks for Youth Parliament members, from Youth Parliament members. So let's start with you, Caleb, member for Ceredigion. Thank you, Chair. So the major question is, who is responsible for trying to mitigate the impacts of climate change? Is it my responsibility, your responsibility, the government's responsibility, or global corporations? The truth is that we're all responsible and we can all make a difference. We can see from figures such as Greta Thunberg just how influential young people can be in tackling this crisis. Greta Thunberg says, "You are never too small to make a difference," and this is entirely true. We as individuals can help. What about reducing how much dairy and meat produce you eat and consume, because that is responsible for 14% of carbon emissions, or ensuring that you purchase local produce from local farmers to reduce food miles and deforestation in the Amazon. On the other hand, why not try and walk or cycle rather than traveling by car when possible? If we all did some of these little things, then the change would be substantial. Certainly, global governments such as China have a role in trying to reduce their carbon emissions, and for nations such as the UK to meet targets and to collaborate on a global level through agreements such as the Paris Agreement. But as David Suzuki says, we're in a giant car heading straight into a brick wall and everyone's arguing over where to sit. So, in my view, it's about time businesses and governments and even us as individuals stop talking and start to take action, and we as young people can make a major difference. Thank you. Excellent, thank you, Caleb. Some very good and interesting points that you've made there, and we will return to those a little later in our debate, because I think we'll now move on to Evan, the Youth Parliament member for Pontypridd, if you're ready. Yes, I am very passionate about the environment, and when I stood for election, that's one of the main things that I was talking about, and everyone in school and everyone in the area agreed that we had to do something, but young people are entirely agreed that things have to change. And I think this coronavirus has shown that people are open to change and people can adapt to different circumstances. I don't think necessarily that they realize that they're ready for change, but when they have to change, they do. And that, I think, says a lot about how we can adapt in terms of environmental policy. And one important thing is diet. And if we can have policies in place in terms of diet, then that would be good in terms of reducing obesity, which is a huge problem in the UK and in Wales, and reducing carbon emission in the production of meat. Clearly, there would be economic problems if we place more burdens on Welsh farmers, but I do think diet is a good place to start. Okay, thank you. Again, some interesting points there. There are a few things there that we'll return to, but certainly there were good points for discussion. So thank you very much, Evan. We'll move on to Abby Carter, Youth Parliament member from Montgomery. So when you're ready. Although I do believe young people and people in general can make a difference, I do think that businesses and corporations should do more to reduce their dependence on plastic, particularly single-use plastics, so that it is easier for people to live life with less waste. Although, of course, everyone as individuals can make a difference too. So you're pursuing the issue of waste and the increase in plastic waste over recent years. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Abby, we'll now move to the second Evan Burgess, representing Aberconwy. So when you're ready, Evan. Thank you. I think when it comes to responsibility, it is everyone's responsibility, and everyone, the public, do have to make the right choices, the choices that do reduce carbon emissions and are beneficial to the environment. But businesses, and more than that, government, also have to make the right choices and make those choices easy for people. So it also, or I feel at least, that it comes down to three pillars in tackling this problem. And those three are how energy is produced, how transport happens, and the food that we eat. And clearly, it's very difficult for the public to make changes in terms of energy production unless people use more solar power, for example, and have panels on their homes. But other than that, government has to push hard and must ensure that more renewables are used, such as solar power, wind generation. Those are all things that the government need to do. Transport is something that the public can make a choice on. We can choose to use more electric vehicles, more cycling, using trains and buses, but government also needs to make those choices easy for people. So improved infrastructure for electric vehicles, better trains and buses, trains traveling across the country to make it easier to travel from one area to another on a train or a bus. And with food, well, I think that comes down to the public's choice. People have to make choices in eating less meat and purchasing foods that aren't packaged in plastic. So it's a mixture of things, and the government has to make the right choices for the environment and make those choices easy for people to adopt. Okay, excellent. You're in Aberconwy there. Have you been inspired in looking out at Gwyntamore in terms of the renewable energy? Does that inspire you? Yes, I pass that quite regularly, and there's a wind turbine up on the mountain too. Yes, it's a striking view when you look out over the sea there. Thank you, Evan. And finally, we'll go to Anwen Rodway, who represents Learning Disability Wales. So Anwen, when you're ready. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anwen Rodway, and I represent Learning Disabilities Wales at the Welsh Youth Parliament. I'm passionate about the environment, and climate change is a threat to our planet and our very existence. Climate change is important to me because it's something that's already having an impact on each and every one of us. You can see evidence of that in the wildfires and floods that have destroyed so much of the planet already, with loss of life and natural habitats causing real damage, including in many of our forests. If we don't all take responsibility for the future of our planet, then I am concerned that green spaces will disappear, sea levels will rise, and coastal communities will be lost to flooding, and the planet as we know it today will disappear forever. This is one of the reasons why I decided to stand to be a member of the Welsh Youth Parliament. As one voice, I didn't feel that there was anything that I could do to ensure real change. I have arranged that school friends help me in litter picks and have organised community litter picks too, but I didn't feel that I was doing enough to actually make a real difference. At the first residential meeting of the Youth Parliament, we discussed issues that are important to us in the Senedd chamber before voting on the three most important issues. I was so happy with the three topics that we chose because they are all issues important to us, namely life skills in the curriculum, mental and emotional health, and rubbish and plastic waste. When I was little, I remember my parents and grandparents saying that throwing rubbish wasn't something that you should do. I suppose I grew up knowing that. Teachers in my primary school would talk about how plastic waste has an impact on wildlife, and that made me very sad, and that's still the case today. Each and every one of us can make a difference. One person can help by going out to pick litter, but if we all step up and all take responsibility and act, then we can make a huge difference if we work together. In conclusion, we should find new uses for those things that we would usually put in the recycling bag. I've helped to make vegetable growing boxes out of old plastic boxes, and I've been planting vegetables in those boxes, and I've painted cardboard boxes to make pen holders from my desk, and we held a competition in our community where we made an astronaut using old shower curtains, plastic bottles, and other plastic products. So saving the planet can be fun too. I hope this has given you some idea as to why this topic is so important to me, and I hope that you will help us to discuss the issues that are most important to you by filling in our surveys. We will be publishing the outcomes in a report, and the Welsh Parliament has committed to working with us to deliver your ideas. Your voice is truly important and can make a difference. Excellent. Thank you very much, Anwen. You've been very busy. Excellent. Just a few things some of you had picked up on in terms of this difference during this lockdown period. Do you really think that there will be a difference when in a few months or a few years' time? Do you really think there will be a difference down the line in terms of people's habits? Do you think things will truly have changed as they have changed during the pandemic? Caleb, I think you touched on this in your presentation. I think there will be a major difference, yes. I think we've seen during the pandemic that, in a way, nature's been given a rest and it's taken over again, and people now appreciate this. And I think we have got back to appreciating our localities. So in the lockdown, people were going out walking in the local areas and noticing nature. I think over the years, we've forgotten to do this because life is so busy. And I think one thing that the pandemic has done is to highlight just how important nature is. But then that all ties in with the problem of plastic waste. And I do think that in future, people will take more notice of this. And I think we've also seen that people are turning to upcycling. And I think many people have been very skillful during this time. And what I see a lot on Facebook and social media is people showing what they've been doing through upcycling. And I think this, as well as recycling, will be even more important in future. What do you think about those pictures that we saw of the beaches and when people were allowed to go back to the beaches on that first weekend, and then we saw all of the rubbish that was left there? How do you tackle that kind of problem? Well, I think it is difficult because ultimately it is down to individuals. It's individuals that have to make the decision when it comes to rubbish and littering. But one of the problems, particularly in a rural area, is the shortage of recycling bins. There are ordinary black bins available, but it's only in towns where you see the recycling bin. So that's one issue. But I don't think that that's an excuse for people just to leave their litter on our beaches. And I think this is one thing that we will have to look at in future. But I think one solution, perhaps, is more recycling bins, particularly in rural areas. Well, we'll return to that point later on because many of you have agreed with that point. But one thing before moving on, I think it was you, Evan, can't quite remember which Evan, but you mentioned investment in green energy. Do you think that the investment made recently, 3 billion, is enough? Or is it enough to get the ball rolling, or do we need a lot more investment? What do you think? We'll go for Evan Burgess first. I don't really know whether the necessary funding is 3 billion or 5 billion. I don't know what exactly is needed, but what I do know is that more investment is always necessary. And as you say, we have wind energy available in my area, but there are far more opportunities in Wales to have things such as the Swansea Tidal Lagoon, which is not now to be built, and those opportunities are there. We have some of the best opportunities in the world and some of the best resources in the world here in Wales, but of course we need far more renewables, and we need to move towards 100% renewable as we move forward, and I don't know exactly how much investment is needed in order to reach that target, but 3 billion is a good start, certainly. And as long as we do move away from non-renewables and do more things like Gwyntamore, then we are moving in the right direction. And that does have to increase in future. Yes, fair points there, because I think it was back in May and June, it's the first time that Britain produced energy without having to use coal. So although coal's been phased out slowly over a period of years, I think it's quite important that we could go 2 months without making any use of coal. So Evan Fairclough, anything to add? Well, yes, I was going to mention the fact that we're not using coal at the moment, which is excellent, and it does show how much progress we've made, but we have to continue moving in that direction. We can't just give up once we get to a particular landmark, and it's also important to help other nations, perhaps less developed nations, so that we provide them with the infrastructure to put them on the right track to make improvements. Okay, some very interesting points from you all. So it's already a very interesting debate. So we'll return to some of the points during the debate. We'll also ask specific questions related to litter and plastic wastes and the environment. For example, do we need better education on recycling, the recycling habits of the younger generation, what the next steps are, and also recycling during the pandemic. And one other point that I did want to mention at the outset too is that at the end of the session, I will ask you all as individuals for one wish that you would want to see delivered in this area. So if you had one wish, what would that be? So have a think about that during the next half hour or 3/4 of an hour during the debate, and it'll be interesting to hear what you would like to see done. So members of the Youth Parliament have shared their views. I wonder what your views are on the issue of litter and plastic waste in your schools. So far in the survey, over 85% of young people are of the view that we need better education on the issue. So what's your experience at school in terms of recycling and reducing plastic waste? Who would like to start? So what kind of education would you like to see more of in our schools? Well, I think a lot of the education comes through your habits, and if you learn good habits in school, that's important. I know in my school, and I've tried to change this, but apparently the school canteen is run by the council rather than the school, which is slightly odd. But there are no recycling bins in the canteen, and that's terrible. And there's so much plastic packaging on everything you buy. If you buy a biscuit, it's covered in plastic. Why? What habits is that teaching young people who are going to go out into the world and do the same when they're adults? So I do think that that has to change. I don't think we should be selling foods in schools which are packed in plastic, and certainly there should be recycling bins in our school canteens. But also schools could have environment days. I know that a lot of schools do that already, where you celebrate the environment and learn about environmental issues. So perhaps we could have days like that. They might be the best option. And particularly in science lessons in year 7, 8 and 9. Now, you mentioned that there are no recycling bins. What's the situation in terms of plastic bottles? Do you take your own bottles to school, or can you buy single-use plastic bottles in canteens? Well, many people do take their own water bottles to school, but we can also buy water bottles in the canteen. So many people just decide to do that rather than take their own water bottle. And clearly that has a negative impact on the environment. If they didn't sell those bottles in the canteen, then everyone would bring their own water bottle, which can, of course, be reused. And we certainly need water fountains around school so that you can refill your bottles. You can't expect children not to drink water all day. Have you raised these points with the school, and what kind of response do you get from teachers or whoever's responsible for this? Well, I've been on school council since I was in year 7, and I was making exactly the same points in year 7, and not much has changed. A few things have changed. We have more bins around school. In terms of recycling bins, there's been a great deal of talk in the past about having a school branded water bottle that everyone could buy, but nothing much has changed actually. Things have changed around the school, but in the canteen particularly, which, as I said, is run by the council, then nothing ever changes. And I've written a lot of letters, and I don't know what else to do. And what year are you in now? I'm going into my last year of schooling this year. So you've been working on this for many years, but haven't had much luck. Yes. Has anyone else had the same experience of a brick wall? Have you even got through that wall, and can you share any ideas with us? I think things are quite similar. I think everyone would agree that things are similar in every school, and we are looking at ways of getting recycling bins, which is a huge problem because they're not available in schools. And I think what's important is that schools should learn that people can change their habits and do things that are good for the environment. So we need to teach people how to recycle. We need to teach people how they can reduce carbon emissions. And that has to come from the schools with recycling bins, less plastic packaging in our canteens. And I do think that things are changing slowly, a lot more slowly than we would want, but things are changing. And we have now got water fountains in the school over the past 2 years, and we don't now sell single-use plastic bottles. We sell water in cartons. And it's a problem, of course, that they can't be reused, of course. We also don't sell takeout food at all. It used to be sold in polystyrene. There was 3 types of polystyrene packaging, and all that has stopped. So change is happening, but it's happening slowly, and we must actually hasten that change, and the education must be in place in order to enable people to make the right choices. So it appears to me that you are saying that we need more education about climate change and the process of producing plastic, the process of recycling, and what happens to that plastic once it's recycled. Do we need more education in this area? And if so, where's that going to come from? Is it within lessons or additional lessons? Or how do you see it being delivered? Do we need more podcasts or more specialists and experts coming into the school, or YouTube videos perhaps? How would you see it developing? I think there are opportunities within the schools, within the lessons that we currently have. I don't know if others have tutorials or lessons which aren't simply maths, Welsh, and so on. So there are opportunities to teach different things in our schools, things that haven't perhaps been taught in the past. And I do think that those lessons do have to be compulsory. And we must ensure that they're not just options, such as podcasting would be. And so we need to learn how to recycle, how to reduce your impact on the planet. Is there an eco-council in your schools which can raise these issues and discuss them with teachers and press the case? Well, I think most schools, or the ones I'm aware of, do have a school council. And in terms of education, the one thing that isn't available as it should be is education on recycling. There's a lot of education on the use of technology and being safe online, But one thing that we should look at in future is to look at more education on recycling. And I think young people particularly do realize that we have to recycle, but perhaps don't know what they can recycle. So I think we need more detail in terms of what is recyclable and what isn't. And in terms of my school, recycling bins, well, the situation is quite positive there. There's a recycling bin in virtually every class and in the canteen. But there is still some room for improvement in terms of the canteen. We still sell single-use plastic bottles, unfortunately, but we have changed from plastic cups to reusable cups, which was introduced this year. So we have started to change. And I think that's what we need to emphasize. I don't think we can change everything overnight, but it's a process. I think most schools now have started that process, and we do need to continue and hasten that process. That would be my hope, at least, because it has emerged from replies to the survey that young people do recycle a lot and also reduce waste. But what's your view on the recycling culture within your age group more generally? Do young people understand the importance of recycling, or is there a lot of work to be done in order to get that message across? How have you seen it among your friends or people within your generation? Well, to be honest, I think people our age do understand the importance of recycling, and if there are bins available, then 90% of young people will use them. So I do think that people do understand the importance of it. The only other thing we need, as Caleb said, is to know how to recycle and what to recycle. Now, I have ready meals sometimes, and I don't know if the packaging should go into the black bin or the recycling bin. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But the other thing we can do is to start at a younger age. So by the time you get to our age, or by the time you become an adult, then recycling would be second nature to you. And also another idea that we had within the Youth Parliament was to have some Welsh Baccalaureate challenge related to the environment, where you would have to pick litter or do something that's positive for the environment, and then you could be assessed for that. So some good ideas there. But what about other ways of reducing waste? Not just recycling, which is of course important, but what about things like making good use of the food in the fridge rather than throwing it away? We should be reusing, or there's composting or upcycling. Are you familiar with these zero waste shops, which do exist in certain towns? What about these other elements of safeguarding our environment beyond recycling? Well, I think the best way to reduce waste is not to buy that waste in the first place. And that's quite an obvious thing to say, but we do have to ensure that single-use plastics isn't sold where it's possible not to sell it. And that's where the ban on things like cotton buds, where it's simply not necessary, is so very effective, but because it does ensure that they are never produced in the first place. And non-plastic products, other ways of wrapping food, for example, do have to be much cheaper and much more widely available. So it does come down to people having non-plastic options, and they have to be easier to access than the plastics. So is that a ban on plastic or a plastic tax? These are all things that we've discussed, and we need to consider these things to make sure that it doesn't make sense to buy plastic anymore. And then that will ensure that it isn't used where it's not necessary. Well, in terms of the plastic tax, do you think that a plastic tax and levying that on the individual who's buying the product is the right way of doing it, or do you need to have some sort of tax on the companies producing these bottles in the first place, or the cotton buds, or any kind of plastic? Do we need to shift the focus onto them rather than the individuals buying the products? How do you think that should work? I think you're right. Yes. We do need to put pressure on businesses too, because people will choose to use less plastic, but that isn't always the case for businesses. And I think that's where a tax on business in terms of plastic usage would be more effective, because it wouldn't get to the supermarket shelves then if there was a change of culture within business. So there is no one size fits all, of course, and it does have to be a balance struck with things such as the plastic bag surcharge, but we do have to shift some of the emphasis onto business. For example, in terms of how things are produced, are there different ways of doing that, for example? And there are cases where it's better for the individual, but that also has to be a burden on business. What's your view of recycling during the pandemic? We've seen far more. I was mentioning Castle Street earlier. Many of them use plastic cups just for the sake of hygiene. They're disposable. So do you think people's habits have changed during the pandemic? Well, yes, I think if you go out, you might buy a water bottle rather than taking a bottle with you because it feels safer. I honestly don't know if plastic usage has increased or decreased during lockdown, because on the one hand, people are going out less and they're stopping in McDonald's less. They're not going to Subway and buying things that are packed in plastics. But if they do go out, they may feel safer because the plastic actually safeguards the product inside. Now, I'm of the view that nothing good happens unless you make it happen. So I would agree with Evan. And it's going back to the issue of businesses. We do need to levy taxes on businesses because it has to make economic sense for a business to move away from plastics. Because at the end of the day, many businesses aren't going to move away from plastics unless it makes economic sense to do so. So the main thing we need to do is put a tax on those businesses so that they will choose something other than plastic, which would make more economic sense to them. What about this ban on single-use plastics? Because one contributor said earlier, with the exception of hospitals, single-use plastics that can't be recycled should be close to being illegal. So what's your view to that statement? Because occasionally single-use plastic is necessary in certain scenarios, such as in hospitals, but for single-use plastics such as packaging on bananas or single-use water bottles, do you think that they should be banned outright? I think the Welsh Government does intend to ban cotton buds and plastic straws now within the next year, I believe. And I do think that this is a good start. It's a difficult question in terms of whether there should be an outright ban on single-use plastics, because I do think that things such as a tax on business, as you mentioned earlier, I think if we were to tax businesses, then those funds could be used to promote a greener economy, and it could then be invested in renewable energies. And many political parties have been talking about a Green New Deal, and the funds raised from taxes such as these could then be spent on such a Green Deal. And I think we need to get the balance right between the individuals and the major corporations. There are a number of countries in Scandinavia, and I think Scotland intends to do this in a few years. They've introduced a deposit return scheme where individuals pay 20%, 20 pence or something similar when they buy plastic, and when they return those plastics, they get their 20 pence back. And that's been successful in Norway and Estonia, with over 80% of plastic bottles being returned. And I think before an outright ban on single-use plastics, we might want to trial a similar system here, but I do understand that time is short, and before too very long, the only solution might be an outright ban on single-use plastics, because if something is a threat to you, then you need to eradicate it, and if the plastics weren't available, then there would be less plastic in the environment. But I do think that occasionally there are other things that we should try before doing that. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the deposit return scheme, because the government has been consulting on this with the UK government, with a pledge of further consultation later in the year. So again, it's an issue of when that consultation happens and how or what emerges from that consultation. But do you think people are lazy if you're only going to get 20 pence back? Is that just too easy for people to forget about that 20 pence? Do you need stronger incentives? Perhaps, but 5 times 20 becomes a pound very quickly. I think it will come down to habit. Ultimately, once you start to do it, when you go to the supermarket, you will be doing it out of force of habit. And I do think that some supermarkets are very keen on this idea, because if they were based in the shops, then people are more likely to shop there, and that's an incentive for people to bring the bottles back, so they can have special offers and so on if people were to return their plastics. So I think business quite likes this idea, and I think it's also going to be good for the economy. So I do think that, of course, it depends on culture and culture change, but it's obviously working in nations such as Germany, Estonia, and Norway, so I don't see why we couldn't try it here. It's interesting, Caleb. You mentioned earlier tax. Now, one thing that's being discussed now is this idea of a carbon tax. So, are you confident as a youth parliament that you're doing the right thing for the environment? Do you think that pursuing something like a carbon tax would be beneficial? Who would like to go next? Yes, I think pursuing something like a carbon tax would work. Because if you look at history, then banning things in the past hasn't worked particularly well in terms of prohibition in the United States. Drugs, well, you could make the case either way, but many people agree that that's not worked particularly well. So I think we need to regulate what happens in the economy, and through regulating the use of carbon and the use of plastic, then we can reduce our usage significantly by some 98% perhaps. But if we need it for something, to save lives, for example, we can still turn to that. So I do think that a carbon tax and those kinds of taxes are the way forward, personally. Abby, did you want to add anything? I've almost forgotten my point, but I would ask, who would pay the carbon tax? Would it be businesses? Well, I think the idea behind it is something like these smart watches or Strava or Garmin, where you input that you've done 10,000 steps in a day, for example. Well, there could be some sort of app which tracked your carbon footprint during any day or any week, and whatever threshold you reach, be it the equivalent of 10,000 steps or 20,000 steps. So once you go up, then there are different thresholds for the tax. So for someone who flies across the world just to have one meeting, their threshold would be higher, so they would be taxed at a higher level. But someone who walks to work every day, doesn't have a car, buys food locally, then it would be lower, so they would be taxed less. Well, I think some people would feel guilty about not doing the right things, and that might help to educate them, or they might just feel guilty, who knows. But perhaps with people who can't afford to reduce plastics because supermarkets make too much use of plastics, and it's cheaper to shop in supermarkets than it is to shop in plastic-free settings. But if they can't afford the different options, then perhaps they will just feel guilty for not doing more, and they will be taxed at a higher level because they don't have the option in terms of what they use. I'm trying to make my point here. No, you made some very interesting and fair points there. Yes, some very good points there. I am aware time's flown by this afternoon, almost an hour has passed already, so we'll move quickly to bins, and you touched on this earlier, but according to the survey, young people feel that there are sufficient bins or rubbish bins in their localities, but there aren't enough recycling bins and refilling stations. Would your experiences fit in with this? Do we need more bins on our high street, or do we need a variety of bins for glass bottles, plastic bottles, and non-recyclable rubbish? Do we need that variety? Caleb, I think you touched on this earlier. Yes, certainly my personal experience, particularly as someone living in a rural area, that there aren't as many bins in villages. The only place where I see recycling bins, and there aren't enough, but it's in the towns, and you do have the option of putting your bottles in a certain section, other produce in other sections, but certainly in villages and rural areas, recycling bins simply aren't available. It's only the litter bins. But I do think that there could be more recycling bins in our towns too. That's my experience. What about education around recycling? Is it too complex at the moment? You, Evan, mentioned having takeaways. Can you recycle this? Can you recycle the other? Does it need to be normalised and made consistent across all counties in Wales, and also to simplify it so that people can understand what can be recycled and what can't? Yes, the simpler the better. We have to make things as easy as possible for people so that people can do the right thing. So if we could have one poster saying, well, in Wales, this is what you can recycle in these bins, and this is what you can't recycle, and I think that would make things much easier for people. Evan? I would disagree with making things simpler, because there are very good reasons for the recycling systems that we have, in the fact that there are different boxes for different kinds of waste. And when you do separate out your waste, the level of recycling and how you can use that recyclate is much better. So I don't think we need to change the system, but certainly the Welsh Government does have a plan for recycling, and they have made recommendations as to how councils should implement that. And if every council were to adopt those recommendations, then that would make things simpler for people, but I think the system recommended by the government is the system used in my county. It is quite simple. It says on the bin, this is for plastic, brown plastic, white plastic, glass. And I do think that that system does work, and there are good reasons for the complexity. And if everything across Wales were the same, then that would make an important contribution. So it would be having no differentiation between the various councils, because, as you mentioned, it's quite simple for you, and the fact that Wales is in the vanguard in terms of recycling in the UK, it's second in Europe and third across the world. It's doing quite a good job of things, and that takes us to our final section, recycling in the pandemic, because in the survey, almost 90% of young people feel that reducing, reusing and recycling is important or very important to them in certain scenarios, such as the home, the school or the community. Why do you think this is important, even in a time of pandemic? So why is it important that people continue to recycle? Although we are in a pandemic, the problems of climate change and the problems faced by our environment haven't gone away, and I think many things have changed as a result of the pandemic. And there's been fewer cars on our roads, which has been positive, but everyone's talking about life after the pandemic as though it's going to be totally different. It's only going to be different if we make it different. So I do think that a great deal has to be done by government specifically, and we need to rebuild the economy after coronavirus in a way that is sustainable and green, not in the short term, but in the long term. Have you spent this period recycling products in your home? And when you mentioned that you've been upcycling, have you been upcycling clothing or old furniture? Or have your friends been doing so? Well, personally, my sister's been making banana cake. It was banana something anyway, because when bananas go brown, you can use them to make some sort of cake, which is really tasty. So we've really cracked down on our food waste, which has been positive. And I think she had a Depop account. I think that's the website where you can buy secondhand clothing, so you're not buying new clothes all the time. And young people can also make money from the site, so that's a good idea, and it's a recommendation if you want to reuse clothing. What about the broader change of attitude? Not just recycling or upcycling. Have you been cycling or walking more rather than getting a lift or jumping on the bus? Have there been changes of attitude for you and your friends? Well, I felt during the pandemic, the one freedom that I had was to get out and do some physical exercise. They were saying that you can do one physical exercise a day, and I always took advantage of that. So I went for a walk every day, and I personally really enjoyed that. And I noticed that many people were going out for physical exercise where they never would in the past, and perhaps that's developed people's desire to get out into the fresh air and have a walk, and that could be important for the future, but we have to keep hold of that because it could slip away in an instant. Well, yes, people can easily slip back into bad habits of not recycling or buying single-use plastic, so I would say that you're entirely right there. It is getting late. I know that we've gone over time, so we were slightly late starting, so I'll finish by saying thank you all for your contributions. You've been excellent. You've all had interesting points, but I asked you at the outset if you had one wish, and I hope you've had some time to think about this. What would your wish be as we come out of this period? So we'll start with Evan Burgess in Aberconwy. Well, mine would be more investment in renewable energy and less use of things like coal. Evan Fairclough. I would like to see a tax on companies using plastic so we can reduce the amount of plastics on supermarket shelves. Caleb. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I would like to see Wales trialling a deposit return scheme so that we're not here in 5 years thinking, well, we could have done that and it could have worked. So I'd like to see it being piloted. Abby. I want the government and businesses to make it easier for people to live their lives with less waste and less impact on the environment. That would be my point. And when to finish? I want to see businesses using less plastics and more paper-based products. Well, if every one of those things were put into practice, I think the world would be a much better place environmentally. So with all of those ideas, it's been excellent. We've had a very interesting discussion, so thank you all very much for participating. I will conclude by encouraging you to complete the online survey, which is being promoted on social media using the hashtag #GorauonGwastraff. So do have a look for that. But I would also encourage you to think about other aspects of global warming, such as the ones that we've discussed during this discussion and the ones that I mentioned during my opening remarks. And who knows, we might see you again. That might be a debate for the future. But for today on litter and plastic waste, I think that concludes our session. Thank you very much and take care. Goodbye.